In this video, we continue with the book titled Clairvoyance by C.W. Leadbeater, specifically as it is applied to clairvoyance relating to seeing things in the past. I am Daisy, your hostess. If you're new to my channel and found me at this video, please make sure to visit my playlist to access previous chapters. And to my family, friends, and subscribers, welcome back. As I mentioned, this book was written in the turn of the 19th century, and it allows us, people of the future, well, the present, to see how far we've come, especially in the areas of developing tolerance to things we know little of, and also patience, because science is a methodical, slow process. It is challenging for science to explain supernatural or supernormal events. If you are clairvoyant, some would call it psychic seeing, it would be wonderful if you could share some of your stories. I believe that the more people are willing to talk about these things, their experiences with these supernormal or supernatural phenomena, the sooner we can accept that we humans are quite special breed. In this video, the author will use the word Akashic records, and he did say that some of the terminology may be unfamiliar to those people who are just embarking on these concepts, and so I'm going to take a minute here to explain it. So I get that. I've been at this since I was 16. I'm like the Hierophant in the tarot deck, or like the fool who sets on a journey, eager for whatever shows up on the path. Even though I feel like I've been a solo traveler, my teacher always takes on a new skin. This could be a coworker, a neighbor, a family member, a stranger, or nature and all its elements. Having this approach allows me a lot of wiggle room and appreciation for life, because life has a lot of twists and turns, and some of you might agree with me on that. And what you believed to be true in one stage of your life, later you'll only prove to be that it was just a piece of the puzzle and not the whole of the puzzle. This does not mean that at that time it was not the truth, and it does not take away from the truth. It only means that it was an important part at that time in your life, and perhaps only the part that could be revealed in relationship to the capacity of understanding. And that's how I believe it is, that we are only given enough to understand and enough to stay curious. But it's up to us if we want to ask and, proceed further. So this Akashic record is a concept originating from Hindu philosophy, and it refers to a cosmic repository of all knowledge that contains every thought, action, and event in the universe. And modern metaphysical thinkers such as Ervin Laszlo has drawn parallels between this ancient idea and quantum field theory, suggesting that the Akashic field could be interpreted as a quantum information field that encodes the fabric of reality. Others propose that it may correspond to scientific concepts such as the zero-point field or the quantum vacuum. So these terms you can look up. I did leave a couple links for you to look at, and I've left them in the description of this video. So remember how I mentioned the painful, slow process of science? Well, to mainstream science, these concepts that I just mentioned, they're not accepted as proof of the Akashic field. But perhaps we can be hopeful that future research in areas like neuroscience and quantum biology may shed light on phenomena associated with it. And I share this as a reminder of the importance of inquiry, creativity, and forward progress, lest we fall back to the dark ages, into the abyss of ignorance and fear. And now, let's find out what the author has to say on using clairvoyance to see into the past. I now turn the page. Clairvoyance by C.W. Leadbeater. This book is in the public domain. Clairvoyance in time, the past. Clairvoyance in time, that is to say, the power of reading the past and the future, is, like all the other varieties, possessed by different people in varying degrees, ranging from the man who has both faculties fully at his command, down to one who only occasionally gets involuntary and very imperfect glimpses or reflections of these scenes of other days. A person of the latter type might have, let us say, a vision of some event in the past, but it would be liable to the most serious distortion, and even if it happened to be fairly accurate, it would almost certainly be a mere isolated picture, and he would probably be quite unable to relate it to what he had occurred before or after, or account for anything unusual which might appear in it. The trained man, on the other hand, could follow the drama connected with his picture backwards or forwards to any extent that might seem desirable, and trace out with equal ease the causes which had led up to it or the results which in turn would produce. We shall probably find it easier to grasp this somewhat difficult section of our subject if we consider it in the subdivisions which naturally suggest themselves, and deal first with the vision which looks backward into the past, leaving for later examination that which pieces of the veil of the future. In each case, it will be well for us to try to understand what we can of the modus operandi, even though our success can at best be only very modified one, owing first to the imperfect information on some parts of the subject at present possessed by our investigators, and secondly, to the recurring failure of physical words to express 100 part even of the little we do know about higher planes and faculties. In the case then of a detailed vision of the remote past, how is it obtained, and to what plane of nature does it really belong? The answer to both these questions is contained in the reply that it is read from the Akashic records. But that statement in return will require a certain amount of explanation for many readers. The word is in truth somewhat of a misnomer, for though the records are undoubtedly read from the Akasha, or matter of the mental plane, yet it is not to it that they really belong. Still worse is the alternative title, Records of the Astral Light, which has sometimes been employed, for these records lie far beyond the astral plane, and all that can be obtained on it are only broken glimpses of a kind of double reflection of them, as will presently be explained. Like so many others of our theosophical terms, the word Akasha has been very loosely used. In some of our earlier books, it was considered as synonymous with astral light, and in others it was employed to signify any kind of invisible matter from Mula Prakriti down to the physical ether. In later books, its use has been restricted to the matter of the mental plane, and it is in that sense that the records may be spoken of as Akashic. For, although they are not originally made on that plane any more than on the astral, yet it is there that we first come definitely into contact with them and find it possible to do reliable work with them. This subject of the records is by no means an easy one to deal with, for it is one of that numerous class which requires for its perfect comprehension faculties of a far higher order than any which humanity has yet evolved. The real solution of its problem lies on planes far beyond any that we can possibly know at present, and any view that we take of it must necessarily be of the most imperfect character, since we cannot but look at it from below instead of from above. The idea which we form of it must therefore be only partial, yet it need not mislead us unless we allow ourselves to think of the tiny fragment which is all that we can see, as though it were the perfect whole. If we are careful that such conceptions as we may form shall be accurate as far as they go, we shall have nothing to unlearn, though much to add. When in the course of our further progress we gradually acquire the higher wisdom, be it understood, then, at the commencement, that a thorough grasp of our subject is an impossibility at the present stage of our evolution, and that many points will arise as to which no exact explanation is yet obtainable, though it may often be possible to suggest analogies and to indicate the lines along which an explanation must lie. Let us then try to carry back our thoughts to the beginning of this solar system to which we belong. We are all familiar with the ordinary astronomical theory of its origin, that which is commonly called the nebular hypothesis, according to which it first came into existence as a gigantic glowing nebula of a diameter fax exceeding that of the orbit of even the outermost of the planets, and then, as in the course of countless ages, that enormous sphere gradually cooled and contracted, the system as we know it was formed. Occult science accepts that theory in its broad outline as correctly representing the purely physical side of the evolution of our system, but it would add that if we confine our attention to this physical side only, we shall have a very incomplete and incoherent idea of what really happened. It would postulate, to begin with, that the exalted being who undertakes the formation of a system, who we sometimes call the logos of the system, first of all forms in his mind a complete conception of the whole of it with all its successive chains of worlds. By the very act of forming that conception, he calls the whole into simultaneous objective existence on the plane of his thought, a plane of course far above all those of which we know anything, from which the various globes descend when required into whatever state of further objectivity may be respectively destined for them. Unless we constantly bear in mind this fact of the real existence of the whole system from the very beginning on a higher plane, we shall be perpetually misunderstanding the physical evolution which we see taking place down here. But occultism has more than this to teach us on the subject. It tells us not only that all this wonderful system to which we belong is called into existence by the logos, both on lower and on higher planes, but also that its relation to him is closer even than that. For it is absolutely a part of him, a partial expression of him upon the physical plane, and that the movement and energy of the whole system is his energy, and is all carried on within the limits of his aura. Stupendous as this conception is, it will yet not be wholly unthinkable to those of us who have made any study of the subject of the aura. We are familiar with the idea that as a person progresses on the upward path, his causal body, which is the determining limit of his aura, distinctly increases in size as well as in luminosity and purity of color. Many of us know from experience that the aura of a pupil who has already made considerable advance on the path is very much larger than that of one who is just setting his foot upon his first step, while in the case of an adept, the proportional increase is far greater still. We read in quite exoteric Oriental scriptures of the immense extension of the aura of the Buddha. I think that 3 miles is mentioned on one occasion as its limit, but whatever the exact measurement may be, it is obvious that we have here another record of this fact of the extremely paid rapid growth of the casual body as man passes on his upward way. There can be little doubt that the rate of his growth would itself increase in geometrical progression, so that it need not surprise us to hear of an adept on a still higher level whose aura is capable of including the entire world at once. And from this, we may gradually lead our minds up to the conception that there is a being so exalted as to comprehend within himself the whole of our solar system. And we should remember that, enormous as this seems to us, it is but as the tiniest drop in the vast ocean of space. So of the Logos, who has in him all the capacities and qualities with which we can possibly endow the highest God we can imagine, it is literally true, as was said of old, that of him and through him and to him are all things, and in him we live and move and have our being. Now, if this be so, it is clear that whatever happens within our system happens absolutely within the consciousness of its logos. And so we at once see that the true record must be his memory. And furthermore, it is obvious that on whatever plane that wondrous memory exists, it cannot be far above anything that we know. And consequently, whatever records we may find ourselves able to read must be only a reflection of that great dominant fact, mirrored in the denser media of the lower planes. On the astral plane, it is at once evident that this is so, that what we are dealing with is only a reflection of a reflection, and an exceedingly imperfect one, for such records as can be reached there are fragmentary in the extreme and often seriously distorted. We know how universally water is used as a symbol of the astral light, and in this particular case, it is a remarkably apt one. From the surface of still water, we may get a clear reflection of the surrounding objects, just as from a mirror, but at the best, it is only a reflection, a representation in 2 dimensions of the 3-dimensional objects, and therefore differing in all its qualities, except color, from that which it represents. And in addition to this, it is always reversed. But let the surface of the water be ruffled by the wind, and what do we find then? A reflection still, certainly, but so broken up and distorted as to be quite useless or even misleading as a guide to the shape and real appearance of the objects reflected. Here and there for a moment, we might happen to get a clear reflection of some minute part of the scene, of a single leaf from a tree, for example, but it would need long labor and considerable knowledge of natural laws to build up anything like a true conception of the object reflected by putting together even a large number of such isolated fragments of an image of it. Now, in the astral plane, we can never have anything approaching to what we have imaged as still surface, but on the contrary, we have always to deal with one in rapid and bewildering motion. Judge, therefore, how little we can depend upon getting a clear and definite reflection. Thus, a clairvoyant who possesses only the faculty of astral sight can never rely upon any picture of the past that comes before him as being accurate and perfect. Here and there, some part of it may be so, but he has no means of knowing which it is. If he is under the care of a competent teacher, he may, by long and careful training, be shown how to distinguish between reliable and unreliable impressions, and to construct from the broken reflection some kind of image of the object reflected. But usually, long before he has mastered those difficulties, he will have developed the mental sight, which renders such labor unnecessary. On the next plane, which we call the mental, conditions are very different. There the record is full and accurate, and it would be impossible to make any mistake in the reading. That is to say, if 3 clairvoyants possessing the powers of the mental plane agreed to examine a certain record there, what would be presented to their vision would be absolutely the same reflection in each case, and each would acquire a correct impression from it in reading it. It does not, however, follow that when they all compared notes later on the physical plane, the reports would agree exactly. It is well known that if 3 people who witness an occurrence down here in the physical world set to work to describe it afterwards, their accounts will differ considerably, for each will have noticed especially those items which most appealed to him, and will insensibly have made them the prominent features of the event, sometimes ignoring other points which were in reality much more important. Now, in the case of an observation on the mental plane, this personal equation would not appreciably affect the impressions received, for since each would thoroughly grasp the entire subject, it would be impossible for him to see its parts out of due proportion. But, except in the case of carefully trained and experienced persons, this factor does come into play in transferring the impressions to the lower planes. It is in the nature of things impossible that any account given down here of a vision or experience on the mental plane can be complete, since 9/10 of what is seen and felt there could not be expressed by physical words at all. And since all expression must therefore be partial, there is obviously some possibility of selection as to the part expressed. It is for this reason that in all our theosophical investigations of recent years, so much stress has been laid upon the constant checking and verifying of clairvoyant testimony, nothing which rests upon the vision of one person only having been allowed to appear in our later books. But even when the possibility of errors from this factor of personal equation has been reduced to a minimum by a careful system of counter-checking, there still remains the very serious difficulty which is inherent in the operation of bringing down impressions from a higher plane to a lower plane. This is something analogous to the difficulty experienced by a painter in his endeavor to reproduce a three-dimensional landscape on a flat surface, that is, practically in 2 dimensions. Just as the artist needs long and careful training of eye and hand before he can produce a satisfactory representation of nature, so does the clairvoyant need long and careful training before he can describe accurately on a lower plane what he sees on a higher one. And the probability of getting an exact description from an untrained person is about equal to that of getting a perfectly finished landscape from one who has never learned how to draw. It must be remembered, too, that the most perfect picture is in reality infinitely far from being a reproduction of the scene which it represents, for hardly a single line or angle in it can ever be the same as those in the object copied. It is simply a very ingenious attempt to make upon one only of our 5 senses, by means of lines and colors on a flat surface, an impression similar to that which would have been made if we had actually had before us the scene depicted, except by a suggestion dependent entirely on our own previous experience. It can convey to us nothing of the roar of the sea, of the scent of the flowers, of the taste of the fruit, or of the softness or hardness of the surface drawn. Of exactly similar nature, though far greater in degree, are the difficulties experienced by a clairvoyant in his attempt to describe upon the physical plane what he has seen upon the astral. And they are further greatly enhanced by the fact that instead of having merely to recall to the minds of his hearers conceptions with which they are already familiar, as the artist does when he paints men or animals, fields or trees, he has to endeavor, by the very imperfect means at his disposal, to suggest them conceptions which in most cases are absolutely new to them. Small wonder then that, however vivid and striking his descriptions may seem to his audience, he himself should constantly be impressed with their total inadequacy, and should feel that his best efforts have entirely failed to convey any idea of what he really sees. And we must remember that in the case of the report given down here of a record read on the mental plane, this difficult operation of transference from the higher to the lower has taken place not once, but twice, since the memory has been brought through the intervening astral plane. Even in a case where the investigator has the advantage of having developed his mental faculties so that he has the use of them while awake in the physical body, he is still hampered by the absolute incapacity of physical language to express what he sees. Try for a moment to realize fully what is called the 4th dimension, of which we said something in an earlier chapter. It is easy enough to think of our own 3 dimensions, to image in our minds the length, breadth, and height of any object, and we see that each of these 3 dimensions is expressed by a line at right angles to both of the others. The idea of the 4th dimension is that it might be possible to draw a 4th line which shall be at right angles to all 3 of those already existing. Now, the ordinary mind cannot grasp this idea in the least, though some few who have a special study of the subject have gradually come to be able to realize 1 or 2 very simple 4-dimensional figures. Still, no words that they can use on this plane can bring any image of these figures before the mind of others, and if any reader who has not specially trained himself along that line will make the effort to visualize such a shape, he will find it quite impossible. Now, to express such a form clearly in physical words would be, in effect, to describe accurately a single object on the astral plane. But in examining the records of the mental plane, we should have to face the additional difficulties of a fifth dimension, so that the impossibility of fully explaining these records will be obvious to even the most superficial observation. We have spoken of the records as the memory of the logos, yet they are very much more than a memory in an ordinary sense of the word. Hopeless as it may be to imagine how these images appear from his point of view, we yet know that as we rise higher and higher, we must be drawing nearer to the true memory, must be seeing more nearly as he sees. So that great interest attaches to the experience of the clairvoyant with reference to these records when he stands upon the Buddhic plane, the higher which his consciousness can reach even when away from the physical body until he attains the level of the arhats. Here, time and space no longer limit him. He no longer needs, as on the mental plane, to pass a series of events in review, for past, present, and future are all alike, simultaneously present to him, meaningless as that sounds down here. Indeed, infinitely below the consciousness of the logos, as even that exalted plane is, it is yet abundantly clear from what we see there that to him the record must be far more than what we call a memory. For all that has happened in the past and all that will happen in the future is happening now, before his eyes, just as are the events of what we call the present time. Utterly incredible, widely incomprehensible, of course, to our limited understanding, yet absolutely true for all that. Naturally, we could not expect to understand at our present stage of knowledge how so marvelous a result is produced, and to attempt an explanation would only be to involve ourselves in a mist of words from which we should gain no real information. Yet a line of thought recurs to my mind, which perhaps suggests the direction in which it is possible that an explanation may lie. And whatever helps us to realize that so astounding a statement may after all not be wholly impossible will be of assistance in broadening our minds. Some 30 years ago, I remember reading a very curious little book called I Think, The Stars and the Earth, the objects of which was to endeavor to show how it was scientifically possible that to the mind of God, the past and the present might be absolutely simultaneous. Its arguments struck me at the time as decidedly ingenious, and I will proceed to summarize them as I think they will be found somewhat suggestive in a connection with the subject which we have been considering. When we see anything, whether it be the book which we hold in our hands or a star millions of miles away, we do so by means of a vibration in the ether, commonly called a ray of light, which passes from the object seen to our eyes. Now, the speed with which this vibration passes is so great, about 186,000 miles in a second, that when we are considering any object in our own world, we may regard it as practically instantaneous. When, however, we come to deal with interplanetary distances, we have to take the speed of light into consideration, for an appreciable period is occupied in traversing these vast spaces. For example, it takes 8 minutes and a quarter for light to travel to us from the sun, so that when we look at the solar orb, we see it by means of a ray of light which left it more than 8 minutes ago. From this follows a very curious result. The ray of light by which we see the sun can obviously report to us only the state of affairs which existed in that luminary when it started on its journey, and would not be in the least affected by anything that happened here after it left. So that we really see the sun not as he is, but as he was 8 minutes ago. That is to say that if anything important took place in the sun, the formation of a new sunspot for instance, an astronomer who was watching the orb through his telescope at the time would be quite unaware of the incident while it was happening, since the ray of light bearing the news would not reach him until more than 8 minutes later. The difference is more striking when we consider the fixed stars, because in their case, the distances are so enormously greater. The pole star, for example, is so far off that light, traveling at the inconceivable speed above mentioned, takes a little more than 50 years to reach our eyes. And from that follows the strange but inevitable inference that we see the pole star not as and where it is at this moment, but as and where it was 50 years ago. Nay, if tomorrow some cosmic catastrophe were to shatter the pole star into fragments, we should still see it peacefully shining in the sky all the rest of our lives. Our children would grow up to middle age and gather their children about them in turn before the news of that tremendous accident reached any terrestrial eye. In the same way, there are other stars so far distant that light takes thousands of years to travel from them to us. And with reference to their condition, our information is therefore thousands of years behind time. Now carry the argument a step further. Suppose that we are able to place a man at the distance of 186,000 miles from the earth, and yet to endow him with the wonderful faculty of being able from that distance to see what was happening here as clearly as though he were still close beside us. It is evident that a man so placed would see everything a second later the time when it really happened, and so at the present moment he would be seeing what happened a second ago. Double the distance and he would be 2 seconds behind time, and so on. Remove him to the distance of the sun, still allowing him to preserve the same mysterious power of sight, and he would look down and watch you doing not what you are doing now, but what you were doing 8 minutes ago and a quarter ago. Carry him away to the pole star, and he would see passing before his eyes the events of 50 years ago. He would be watching the childish gambols of those who at the very same moment were really middle-aged men. Marvelous as this may sound, it is literally and scientifically true, and cannot be denied. The little book went on to argue logically enough that God, being almighty, must possess the wonderful power of sight which we have been postulating for our observed, and further, that being omnipresent, he must be at each of the stations which we mentioned, and also at every intermediate point, not successively but simultaneously. Granting these premises, the inevitable deduction follows that everything which has ever happened from the very beginning of the world must be at this very moment taking place before the eye of God, not a mere memory of it, but the actual occurrence itself being under his observation. All this is materialistic enough and on the plane of purely physical science, and we may therefore be assured that it is not the way in which the memory of the Logos acts. Yet it is neatly worked out and absolutely incontrovertible, and as I have said before, it is not without its use, since it gives us a glimpse of some possibilities which otherwise might not occur to us. But it may be asked, how is it possible, amid the bewildering confusion of these records of the past, to find any particular picture when it was wanted? As a matter of fact, the untrained clairvoyant usually cannot do so without some special link to put him en rapport with the subject required. Psychometry is an instance in point, and it is quite probable that our ordinary memory is really only another presentment of the same idea. It seems as though there were a sort of magnetic attached or affinity between any particle of matter and the record which contains its history, an affinity which enables it to act as a kind of conductor between that record and the faculties of anyone who can read it. For example, I once brought from Stonehenge a tiny fragment of stone, not larger than a pin's head, and on putting this into an envelope and having it sent to a psychometer who had no idea what it was, she at once began to describe that wonderful ruin and the desolate country surrounding it, and then went on to picture vividly what were evidently scenes from its early history, showing that the infinitesimal fragment had been sufficient to put her into communication with the records connected with the spot from which it came. The scenes through which we pass in the course of our life seem to act in the same manner upon the cells of our brain as did the history of Stonehenge upon that particular of stone. They establish a connection with those cells by means of which our mind is put in rapport with that particular portion of the records, and so we remember what we have seen. Even a trained clairvoyant needs some link to enable him to find the record of an event of which he has no previous knowledge. If, for example, he wished to observe the landing of Julius Caesar on the shores of England, there are several ways in which he might approach the subject. If he happened to have visited the scene of the occurrence, the simplest way would probably be to call up the image of that spot and then run back through its records until he reached the period desired. If he had not seen the place, he might run back in time to the date of the event and then search the channel for a fleet of Roman galleys, or he might examine the records of Roman life at about that period, where he would have no difficulty in identifying so prominent a figure as Caesar, or in tracing him when he found through all his Gallic wars until he set his foot upon British land. People often inquire as to the aspect of these records, whether they appear near or far away from the eye, whether the figures in them are large or small, whether the pictures follow one another as in a panorama or melt into another like dissolving views, and so on. One can only reply that their appearance varies to a certain extent according to the conditions under which they are seen. Upon the astral plane, the reflection is most often a simple picture, though occasionally the figures seen would be endowed with motion. In this latter case, instead of a mere snapshot, a rather longer and more perfect reflection has taken place. On the mental plane, they have two widely different aspects. When the visitor to that plane is not thinking specially of them in any way, the records simply for a background to whatever is going on, just as the reflections in a pier glass at the end of a room might form a background to the life of the people in it. It must always be borne in mind that under these conditions, they're really merely reflections from the ceaseless activity of a great consciousness upon a far higher plane, and have very much the appearance of an endless succession of the recently invented cinematographs or living photographs. They do not melt into one another like dissolving views, nor do a series of ordinary pictures follow one another, but the action of the reflection figures constantly goes on, as though one were watching the actors on a distant stage. But if the trained investigator turns his attention specially to any one scene, or wishes to call it up before him, an extraordinary change at once takes place, for this is the plane of thought, and to think of anything is to bring it instantaneously before you. For example, if a man wills to see the records of that event to which we before referred, the landing of Julius Caesar, he finds himself in a moment not looking at any picture, but standing on the shore among the legionaries, with the whole scene being enacted around him, precisely in every respect as he would have seen it if he had stood there in the flesh on that autumn morning in the year 55 BC. Since what he sees is but a reflection, the actors are of course entirely unconscious of him, nor can any effort of his change the course of their action in the smallest degree, except only that he can control the rate at which the drama shall pass before him, can have the events of a whole year rehearsed before his eyes in a single hour, or can at any moment stop the movement altogether and hold any particular scene in view as a picture as long as he chooses. In truth, he observes not only what he would have seen if he had been there at the time in the flesh, but much more. He hears and understands all that the people say, and he is conscious of all their thoughts and motives. And one of the most interesting of the many possibilities which open up before one who has learned to read the records is the study of the thought of ages long past. The thought of the cavemen and the lake dwellers, as well as that which ruled the mighty civilizations of Atlantis, of Egypt, or Chaldea. What splendid possibilities open up before the man who is in full possession of this power may easily be imagined. He has before him a field of historical research of most entrancing interest. Not only can he review at his leisure all history with which we are acquainted, correcting as he examines it the many errors and misconceptions which have crept into the accounts handed down to us. He can also range at will over the whole story of the world from its very beginning, watching the slow development of intellect in man, the descent of the lords of the flame, and the growth of the mighty civilizations which they founded. Nor is his study confined to the progress of humanity alone. He has before him, as in a museum, all the strange animal and vegetable forms which occupied the stage in days when the world was young. He can follow all the wonderful geological changes which have taken place, and watch the course of the great cataclysms which have altered the whole face of the earth again and again. In one especial case, an even closer sympathy with the past is possible to the reader of the records. If in the course of his enquiries he has to look upon some scene in which he himself has in a former birth taken part, he may deal with it in two ways. He can either regard it in the usual manner as a spectator, though always be it remembered as a spectator whose insight and sympathy are perfect, or he may once more identify himself with that long-dead personality of his, may throw himself back for the time into that life of long ago, and absolutely experience over again the thoughts and the emotions, the pleasures and the pains of a prehistoric past. No wilder, more vivid adventures can be conceived than some of those through which he thus may pass. Yet though in all he must never lose hold of the consciousness of his own individuality, must retain the power to return at will to his present personality. It is often asked how it is possible for an investigator accurately to determine the date of any picture from the far distant past which he dissenters from the records. The fact is that it's sometimes rather tedious work to find an exact date, but the thing can usually be done if it is worthwhile to spend the time and trouble over it. If we are dealing with Greek or Roman times, the simplest method is usually to look into the mind of the most intelligent person present in the picture and see what date he supposes it to be. Or the investigator might watch him writing a letter or other document and observe what date, if any, was included in what was written. When once the Roman or Greek date is thus obtained, to reduce it to our own system of chronology is merely a matter of calculation. Another way, which is frequently adopted, is to turn from the scene under examination to a contemporary picture in some great and well-known city such as Rome, and note what monarch is reigning there, or who are the consuls for the year, and when such data are discovered, a glance at any good history will give the rest. Sometimes a date can be obtained by examining some public proclamation or some legal document. In fact, in the times of which we are speaking, the difficulty is easily surmounted. The matter is by no means so simple, however, when we come to deal with periods much earlier than this, with a scene from early Egypt, Chaldea, or China, or to go further back still, from Atlantis itself or any of its numerous colonies. A date can still be obtained easily enough from the mind of any educated man, but there is no longer any means of relating it to our system of dates, since the man will be reckoning by eras of which we know nothing, or by the reigns of kings whose history is lost in the night of time. Our methods, nevertheless, are not yet exhausted. It must be remembered that it is possible for the investigator to pass the records before him at any speed that he may desire, at the rate of a year in a second, if he will, or even very much faster still. Now there are one or two events in ancient history whose dates have already been accurately fixed, as for example, the sinking of Poseidonis in the year 9564 BC. It is therefore obvious that if from the general appearance of the surrounding it seems probable that a picture seen is within measurable distance of one of these events, it can be related to that event by the simple process of running through the record rapidly and counting the years between the two as they pass. Still, if those years ran into 1,000, as they might sometimes do, this plan would be insufferably tedious. In that case, we are driven back upon the astronomical method. in consequence of the movement which is commonly called the precession of the equinoxes, though it might more accurately be described as a kind of second rotation of the Earth, the angle between the equator and the ecliptic steadily but very slow varies. Thus, after long intervals of time, we find the pole of the Earth no longer pointing towards the same spot in the apparent sphere of the heavens, or in other words, our pole star is not, as at present, at Ursa Minoris, but some other celestial body. And from this position of the pole of the Earth, which can easily be ascertained by careful observation of the night sky of the picture under consideration, an approximate date can be calculated without difficulty. In estimating the date of occurrences which took place millions of years ago in earlier races, the period of a secondary rotation or the precession of the equinoxes is frequently used as a unit. But of course, absolute accuracy is not usually required in such cases, round numbers being sufficient for all practical purposes in dealing with epochs so remote. The accurate reading of the records, whether of one's own past lives or those of others, must not, however, be thought of as an achievement possible to anyone without careful previous training. As has been already remarked, though occasional reflections may be had upon the astral plane, the power to use the mental sense is necessary before any reliable reading can be done. Indeed, to minimize the possibility of error, that sense ought to be fully at the command of the investigator while awake in the physical body, and to acquire that faculty needs years of ceaseless labor and rigid self-discipline. Many people seem to expect that as soon as they have signed their application and joined the Theosophical Society, they will at once remember at least 3 or 4 of their past births. Indeed, some of them promptly begin to imagine recollections and declare that in their last incarnation they were Mary Queen of Scots, Cleopatra, or Julius Caesar. Of course, such extravagant claims simply bring discredit upon those who are so foolish as to make them. But unfortunately, some that discredit is liable to be reflected, however unjustly, upon the society to which they belong, so that a man who feels seething within him the conviction that he was Homer or Shakespeare would do well to pause and apply common sense tests on the physical plane before publishing the news to the world. It is quite true that some people have had glimpses of scenes from their past lives in dreams, but naturally these are usually fragmentary and unreliable. I had myself in earlier life an experience of this nature. Among my dreams, I found that one was constantly recurring, a dream of a house with a portico overlooking a beautiful bay, not far from a hill on the top of which rose a graceful building. I knew that house perfectly well, and was as familiar with the position of its rooms and the view from its door as I was with those of my home in this present life. In those days, I knew nothing about reincarnation, so that it seemed to me simply a curious coincidence that this dream should repeat itself so often. And it was not until some time after that I had joined the society that, when one who knew was showing me some pictures of my last incarnation, I discovered that this persistent dream had been, in a reality, a partial recollection, and that the house which I knew so well was the one in I was born more than 2,000 years ago. But although there are several cases on record in which some well-remembered scene has thus come through from one life to another, a considerable development of occult faculty is necessary before an investigator can definitely trace a line of incarnations, whether they be his own or another man's. This will be obvious if we remember the conditions of the problem which has to be worked out. To follow a person from this life to the one preceding it, it is necessary, first of all, to trace his present life backwards to his birth, and then to follow up in reverse order the stages by which the ego descended into incarnation. This will obviously take us back eventually to the condition of the ego upon the highest levels of the mental plane. So it will be seen that to perform this task effectually, the investigator must be able to use the sense corresponding to that exalted level while awake in his physical body. In other words, his consciousness must be centered in the reincarnating ego itself and no longer in the lower personality. In that case, the memory of the ego being aroused, his own past incarnations will be spread out before him like an open book, and he would be able, if he wished, to examine the conditions of another ego upon that level and trace him backwards through the lower mental and astral lives which led up to it, until he came to that last physical death of that ego and through it to his previous life. There's no way but this in which the chain of lives can be followed through with absolute certainty, and consequently we may at once put aside as conscious or unconscious impostors those people who advertise that they're able to race out anyone's past incarnations for so many shillings a head. Needless to say, the true occultist does not advertise, and never under any circumstances accepts money for any exhibition of his powers. Assuredly, the student who wishes to acquire the power of following up a line of incarnations can do so only by learning from a qualified teacher how the work is to be done. There have been those who persistently asserted that it was only necessary for a man to feel good and devotional and brotherly, and all the wisdom of the ages would immediately flow in upon him. But a little common sense will at once expose the absurdity of such a position. However a good child may be, if he wants to know the multiplication table, he must set to work and learn it. And the case is precisely similar with the capacity to use spiritual faculties. The faculties themselves will not doubt manifest as the man evolves, but he can learn how to use them reliable and to the best advantage only by steady hard work and persevering effort. Take the case of those who wish to help others while on the astral plane during sleep. It is obvious that the more knowledge they possess here, the more valuable will their services be on that higher plane. For example, the knowledge of languages would be useful to them, for though on the mental plane man can communicate directly by thought transference, whatever their languages may be, on the astral plane this is not so, and a thought must be definitely formulated in words before it is comprehensible. If therefore you wish to help a man on that plane, you must have some language in common by means of which you can communicate with him, and consequently, the more languages you know, the more widely useful you will be. In fact, there's perhaps no kind of knowledge for which a use cannot be found in the work of the occultist. It would be well for all students to bear in mind that occultism is the apotheosis of common sense, and that every vision which comes to them is not necessarily a picture from the Akashic records, nor every experience a revelation from on high. It is better far to err on the side of healthy skepticism than of over-credulity, and it is an admirable rule never to hunt about for an occult explanation of anything when a plain and obvious physical one is available. Our duty is to endeavor to keep our balance always, and never lose our self-control, but to take a reasonable, common-sense view of whatever may happen to us. So shall we be better theosophists, wiser occultists, and more useful helpers than we have ever been before. As usual, we find examples of all degrees of the power to see into this memory of nature, from the trained man who can consult the record for himself at will, down to the person who gets nothing but occasional vague glimpse, or has even perhaps had only one such glimpse. But the man who possesses this faculty only partially and occasionally still finds it of the deepest interest. The psychometer who needs an object physically connected with the past in order to bring it all into life again around him, and the crystal gazer who can sometimes direct his less certain astral telescope to some historic sense of long ago, may both derive the greatest enjoyment from the exercise of their respective gifts, even thought they may not always understand exactly how the results are produced, and may not even have them fully under control under all circumstances. In many cases of the lower manifestation of these powers, we find that they are exercised unconsciously. Many a crystal gazer watches scenes from the past without being able to distinguish them from visions of the present, and many a vaguely psychic person finds pictures constantly arising before his eyes without ever realizing that he is, in effect, psychometrizing the various objects around him as he happens to touch them or stand near them. An interesting variant of this classic of psychics is the man who is able to psychometrize persons only, and not inanimate objects, as it is more usual. In most cases, this faculty shows itself erratically, so that such a psychic will, when introduced to a stranger, often see in a flash some prominent event in that stranger's earlier life, but on the other similar occasions will receive no special impressions. More rarely we meet with someone who gets details visions of the past life of everyone whom he encounters. Perhaps one of these best examples of this class was the German writer Schoecke, who describes in his autobiography this extraordinary power of which he found himself possessed. He says, "It has happened to me occasionally at the first meeting with a total stranger, when I have been listening in silence to his conversation, that his past life up to the present moment, with many minute circumstances belonging to one or other particular scene in it, has come across me like a dream, but distinctly, entirely involuntarily, and unsought, occupying in duration of a few minutes. For a long time I was disposed to consider these fleeting visions as a trick of the fancy, the more so as my dream vision displayed to me the dress and movements of the actors, the appearance of the room, the furniture, and other accidents of the scene, till on one occasion, in an awesome mood, I narrated to my family the secret history of a sempstress who had just before quitted the room. I had never seen the person before. Nevertheless, the hearers were astonished, and laughed, and would not be persuaded but that I had a previous acquaintance with the former life of the person, inasmuch as what I had stated was perfectly true. I was not less astonished to find that my dream vision agreed with reality. I then gave more attention to the subject, and as often as propriety allowed of it, I related to those whose lives had so passed before me the substance of my dream vision, to obtain from them its contradiction or confirmation. On every occasion, its confirmation followed, not without amazement on the part of those who gave it. On a certain fair day, I went into the 2 of Walshet accompanied by 2 young foresters, who are still alive. It was evening, and tired with our walk, we went into an inn called the Vine. We took our supper with a numerous company at the public table, when it happened that they made themselves merry over the peculiarities and simplicity of the Swiss in connection with the belief of mesmerism, Leadbeater's physiognomical system, and the like. One of my companions, whose national pride was touched by their raillery, begged me to make some reply, particularly in answer to a young man of superior appearance who sat opposite and had indulged in unrestrained ridicule. It happened that the events of this person's life had just previously passed before my mind. I turned to him with the question whether he would reply to me with truth and candor if I narrated to him the most secret passages of his history, he being as little known to me as I to him. That would, I suggested, go something beyond Leadbeater's physiognomical skill. He promised if I told the truth to admit it openly. Then I narrated the events with which my dream vision had furnished me, and the stable learned the history of the young tradesman's life, of his school years, his peccadilloes, and finally of a little act of roguery committed by him on the strong box of his employer. I described the uninhabited room with its white walls, where to the right of the brown door there had stood upon the table a small back, money chest, etc. The man, much struck, admitted the correctness of each circumstance, even which I could not expect of the last. And after narrating this incident, the worthy Strokey calmly goes to wonder whether perhaps after all this remarkable power, which he had so often displayed, might not really have been always the result of mere chance coincidence. Comparatively few accounts of persons possessing this faculty of looking back into the past are to be found in the literature of the subject, and it might therefore be supposed to be much less common than provision. I suspect, however, that the truth is rather that it is much less commonly recognized. As I said before, it may very easily happen that a person may see a picture of the past without recognizing it as such, unless there happens to be in it something which attracts special attention, such as a figure in armor or an antique costume. A provision also might not always be recognized such at the time, but the occurrence of the event foreseen recalls it vividly at the same time that it manifests its nature, so that it is unlikely to be overlooked. It is probable, therefore, that occasional glimpses of these astral reflections of the Akashic records are commoner than the published accounts would lead us to believe. End of chapter. We head over to the next video, but before we do, please do like, share, and subscribe.